Hello, comrade babies. Pleased to be listening to Holding My Order Terrible Dresser, his deep-diving historisky podcast regarding in Cincinnati, WRKP. I am your Tovarich, Robert Dankovich Magdugski, and at all times being with me is Comrade Mikhail Mikhailovich Grasov. Nastorovia, Mikhail.
You know, technically, my patronymic would be Mikhail Yosefovich.
Very good.
So, good morning, comrade. We have a very, very exciting pair of episodes to talk about today, all in glory for the people, obviously.
Exactly. Did you like that? Were you whisked away back to the Manichaean wilderness of mirrors that was the Cold War? Because if you were, it's because today we are watching a taut espionage thriller, WKRP episode, The Americanization of Ivan, followed by the psychosexual drama of Les's Groupie.
Yeah, these episodes feel very 70s, right? We've got, even though it's in the 80s, we've got
I think there's an 80s thing called Cold War and kind of a Fatal Attraction light sort of thing.
Oh,
I think this is a good 80s pair.
Is Cleveland fun play?
Well, it's a magnificent place.
Well, good. Hold me closer, tiny dancer.
That's another problem they've got.
So yeah, the Americanization of Ivan, first things first, let's get it out of the way. Everybody knows we have a very cryptic title to our podcast. We explained it in an episode back in season 1. But this is the episode where we took a edited line from the syndicated version of the show, meant to completely erase all mention, in a Stalinist fashion, completely erase all mention of Elton John's Hold Me Closer, Tiny Dancer, when our friend Ivan, the representative from the Moscow Agricultural Bureau, says to Les in the lobby of WKRP, "Hold my order, terrible dresser."
Yes, that's right. Do we explain that clearly enough? The episode involves a Soviet hog expert. A delegation of Soviet hog experts are visiting Cincinnati, and one of them, upon catching a glimpse of Bailey, quite reasonably decides to defect to America. And we both misremembered. We thought that the final line was delivered to Bailey as sort of because they have a kind of, not that it doesn't go anywhere, but there's the implication that he's in love with her, or that there's a possibility of romance, or at least I remembered this episode and that line as having a lot more gravitas than it actually did. I thought it was kind of like a touching farewell to her, touching but funny farewell to her, as he was either sent back to the behind the Iron Curtain, or the Cold War was coming between them.
Yeah.
But in fact, he just has to go to Cleveland.
And defect there, right?
He just has to go to Cleveland and defect there, and the line is delivered to Les.
I misremembered this episode a ton too, Rob. And, I did remember it being more like a espionage thriller and definitely having more with sort of stuff happening with Bailey and Ivan. But it's a pretty slowly paced episode. I think that's best demonstrated by the scene at the press conference. The only two people to show up for these hog experts, by the way, are Les and Bailey, right?
That's nice.
And, Les and Ivan have a back and forth, which I really wanted to be as deep and meaningful as like the kitchen debates, with Khrushchev and Nixon. But
about hogs, the hog debates, the Cincinnati hog debates.
Exactly. But it really just ends up being the tried and true translation joke. I mean, I think ultimately I liked the episode.
Oh, yeah.
I was kind of expecting more, but there are some great bits. Again, maybe it's a situation where Andy kind of feels like he missed his calling. He's like, oh man, I'm smuggling a Russian across Ohio in the dead of night. Who says my life isn't working out?
That's a beautiful line. That's right. It's a little bit like the hunting the bonefish. That's gotta be fun. He's just
exactly.
like Andy's kind of, his enthusiasm for his excitement is delightful.
Okay. Listen, we're all set. Here's your coat.
Thank you.
Damn, I like this cloak and dagger stuff, huh?
Yeah?
Carrying a Russian across Ohio in the dead of night? You telling me my life ain't working out?
A Bailey episode. Always enjoy an episode that gives Bailey lots to do.
Mm-hmm.
Fun to have all of the Cold War Russian stuff, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And it rests, pretty heavily on a couple of guest stars. Michael Pataki, who we'll talk about later as Ivan, as the Russian, is fine, but I think that to me, the scene stealer is our friend Sam Anderson from Lost and Mason Noble from the first season of WKRP.
Well, we don't get very many visitors here. Occasional work visa application. Sometimes my wife drops up, we go to lunch.
Why do you have a picture of Richard Nixon on the wall?
They never sent me a Carter.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned in the notes getting ready for the episode was that he does a great job. You couldn't get a much more diametrically opposite type character than this immigration officer in Cincinnati who understandably doesn't see a lot of business at his immigration office.
Yes.
You know, he says he's got this little tiny sort of barred off cubicle, and he tells Bailey and Ivan to come into his office, but there's only room for 2 people, so Andy stays outside the office, which is basically just right over the railing, so he kind of leans in on the immigration interview. And he's so not busy that he still has a kind of sad-looking, almost Dorian Gray-like portrait of Richard Nixon above his desk.
Richard Nixon is looming over his desk. That's right. Bailey asks him about it because they never sent him a Carter.
Which, of course, completely elides Gerald Ford, which is also part of the joke, you know?
They never sent him a Ford or a Carter. That's right. It's also, it's symbolic. I think we've talked about how, Nixon looms over WKRP and over the entirety of the 70s. So it's perfectly appropriate to have his portrait still hanging there, looming over them.
Yeah. So Sam Anderson, as the immigration officer, as you said, tells, this isn't a consulate. You're going to need to go to Cleveland for that. And that sets up the ending of the episode, which, like you said, Rob, we had that discussion in the podcast when we were talking about Hold My Order Terrible Dresser. We're like, does he get dragged off to the gulag after trying to defect and failing? But no, it allows the sort of ending to be that wistful goodbye with the combination of the hope that Ivan's going to get to defect in Cleveland at the consulate there.
Right. They leave it open. But in my mind, it was like much more of a farewell than just, I'll just defect tomorrow in Cleveland.
Yeah. I mean, that's the sort of guest star thing again, the existential thing. We're never going to see Ivan again.
Yeah.
We just have to assume everything went perfectly for him in Cleveland when he tried to defect.
Yeah. And that he wasn't he didn't get an ice pick in the back of his brain from Felicity and character actress Margot Martindale. We'll get to them.
Oh yeah. Oh god. Yeah. We'll get to the Americans as well. As you can tell, Rob and I are very excited to spin off from the episode and talk about all the stuff but maybe we should start talking about that because
sure.
This episode takes place in the waning years of the Carter administration, as we talked about with the Carter joke. Reagan is not yet president, but there is this great narrative that we see. I guess maybe it happened a lot in the 70s and the 80s of defection, of Soviet citizens coming to America, seeing the department stores full of goods and the grocery stores full of goods and just having this mental collapse that means I just have to get out of the Soviet Union. I've got to become a Westerner, and embrace decadent West, as somebody might say,
Well, this really did happen, of course. People for decades had been sneaking across the Berlin Wall in various ways and being smuggled out in the bottom of cars or, in all kinds of elaborate ways. And then, the famous defectors are like performers and athletes like Mikhail Baryshnikov defected in the 70s, the dancer, but I think Nadia Comaneci and Martina Navratilova.
Both from satellite states, but, again, you're right. They're able to travel, right? They're able to get to the West, even as a tourist or a performer. And again, if you've got the ability and the publicity of being a celebrity, it gives you a lot of opportunity to, shake your handlers and get away and apply for asylum.
Yeah, I mean, technically, if anybody leaves the Soviet Union or the Eastern Bloc, is it defecting or is it only defecting when you are important in some way?
Well, no, that's what I was going to say is that I think that when you use the word defection in the 50s and 60s, you're almost exclusively talking about spies. It's the Le Carré sort of, this person managed to, again, shake handlers or, shake their, coworkers in whatever espionage agency they have. And come over and be a double agent. And again, that's the world Les lives in, right? That's, he assumes that this is some kind of great ploy to steal American hog secrets. But in the 70s and 80s, you're right. I think that the increased cultural interchange between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and the West and the Soviet Union, allowed more and more, again, they're not ordinary citizens, obviously. These are people who are, able to travel and have a great public image.
You remember the role-playing game Top Secret?
I do. It was one of the first role-playing games I ever played, actually. It was that, first edition D&D, and Marvel Superheroes were the 3 I played in junior high.
Sweet. Well, that, of course, great Cold War espionage tales that produced. And I remember there was a module for Top Secret where there was a Russian, cryptography expert who you were helping to defect, to escape to the West. And he was basically Rubik. He had the Rubik's Cube inventor.
Oh, yeah.
He had a different name, but he had invented some puzzle that that was beloved by children, but he also knew all the codes to the Soviet nuclear codes and stuff, and so you had to get him out of Czechoslovakia or something.
What was Rubik himself important in the Warsaw Pact, sort of mathematicians, computer scientists, was his, because he didn't defect. The Rubik's Cube was actually sold first in Hungary, I think, and then made its way over to the West in some kind of weird licensing agreement with it is like something out of a Le Carré, Russia House.
Yeah, let's ask Wikipedia. Erno Rubik is a Hungarian inventor, architect, and professor of architecture.
Oh, an architect, okay.
In the 70s, he was professor of architecture at the Budapest College of Applied Arts.
Oh.
It was during this time, a 70s thing, that he built designs for a three-dimensional puzzle and completed the first prototype of the Rubik's Cube in 1974.
And then it spent a little time in Hungarian toy stores. Those must have been fantastic to walk through. There's a shelf with a single Rubik's Cube and a wooden soldier on it or something like that.
He couldn't find a manufacturer in Hungary due to the rigid planned economy of Hungary at the time. Eventually was able to find a small company that worked with plastic and made it. And that company licensed it to the New York-based Ideal Toys, which in 1979 rebranded the Magic Cube to the Rubik's Cube before its introduction to an international audience in 1980. So once again, we are exactly topical with this.
So really, it wasn't Rubik that defected, it was the cube.
Just the cube. Rubik was stuck in Hungary. The cube made it over.
And then he got his own cartoon in the 80s, so there you go.
Yeah, he was saving Christmas with Mr. T and Menudo.
I love Christmas.
Thank you, Rubik. You are a stupendo.
But one thing's missing. Something around here the kids don't get to see very often.
What's that?
Snow! Rubik Fix! Oh, Rubik, this is the best Christmas present ever.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, Rob, 1980, kind of a crucial year. We're about to see the Carter-Reagan, election come into play. Jimmy Carter dealing with a lot of international issues at this time. We've talked about the Iranian hostage crisis, which is obviously still ongoing at this point, but there's another Central Asian sort of proxy war going on right now as well, and that's happening in Afghanistan.
Yes, of course. At exactly this moment, this episode aired in January 1980, and at just this moment, the Cold War is heating up or getting colder, depending on which metaphor you use to mean getting worse. The 70s, was marked with a certain amount of thaw. In the early mid 70s, détente,
SALT agreements,
START agreements, Nixon and Kissinger, sort of realpolitik. And we associate the re-colding of the Cold War with Reagan, but really even before Reagan came in the late 1970s, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, I think.
Yep.
And we talked already about the boycott of the Olympics.
Yep.
Les inspired it a couple of episodes ago, but right in January 1980, Carter would issue an ultimatum about the Olympics. And also, Carter was also, even before Reagan became president, Carter was getting much tougher with the Soviets in his language and his actions. They the United States cut off grain shipments to the Soviet Union in early 1980. And yeah, definitely this is an era of the Cold War, rising Cold War tensions that would continue for the first half of the 1980s.
It strikes me thinking about this and looking at him in an election year, Carter in an election year, right? Having to get tough with the Soviets. maybe not his initial instinct, but something that's a kind of tried and true thing for Democrats to do, to look tough, Goes back as far as Kennedy in the 1960 debates. He was kind of impelled to take a harder line on Cuba than even Nixon did in order to make up for perceived, liberal democratic weakness on communism.
Right. And Carter was looking for... Carter's forte was not foreign policy, but he was looking for a new framework for U.S. foreign policy, and for a while he thought he had it in human rights, sort of saying that U.S., rather than just thinking of everything in terms of the Cold War, the United States would stand for human rights around the globe. But that effectively did heat up the Cold War, because it meant that he, felt compelled to respond to things like Afghanistan and Soviet treatment of, dissidents in the Eastern Bloc. And then on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I can't remember the exact progression of, Brezhnev, Chernenko, Andropov, but, this is the early 80s is when we have this succession of elderly, all these same generation as Khrushchev, but these guys coming in for a few months at a time, these general secretaries. And so that, the leadership in the Soviet Union is very ossified and at its most kind of dinosaur-ish, in the years before Gorbachev.
And I feel like Carter earned a lot of foreign policy chits when he negotiated peace agreements with Israel and Egypt, and
that's right.
Kind of had worked to be this statesman. Like a lot of presidents who don't come in excelling at foreign policy, he kind of got thrown into a lot of situations. The governor of a southern state, doesn't get that many opportunities to talk foreign policy before becoming president.
That's right, and I think he had a strong ally in Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski, if I'm saying that right, was kind of Carter's Kissinger. And
we used up all our Russian at the beginning of the podcast.
3CP1 on your dial, Moscow Television.
Hello, people! Welcome to What Fits into Russia. Yesterday, the last country we put in place was Angola. And look, with these other countries, not even half filling Mother Russia because of its enormous size. And look at rest of world. He's almost gone. So today, let's put the so-called giant country of Argentina into place. Look! It looks like tiny sausage against the vast, colossal size of Mother Russia. But that is only a country, you say. What about the continent? Surely there is a continent somewhere in the world big enough to fill Mother Russia. Well, too bad for capitalist convicts and kangaroos who inhabit this godforsaken place, Australia. We put this into place. There we go. Look! Giant continent! Ha! Giant joke!
So these geopolitical developments, the slight thawing of the Cold War in the 70s, and then the refreezing or reheating, I'm never going to know which way to go on that, in the 80s, all had echoes in pop culture. And so this is really our chance to kind of talk about, how deeply the Cold War, this crazy, when you think about it in retrospect, just this crazy system and structure that, kids today just almost can't believe was real, that how deeply it informed, the popular culture on kind of every level, from the serious to the ridiculous to the sublime kind of thing. And I think that just that line, hold my order, terrible dresser, hold me closer, tiny dancer. The reason that Ivan is dropping, Elton John lyrics, calls Bailey Blue Jean Baby, is that in 1979, Elton John was one of the first, or maybe the first, Western rock star to perform on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so he did this tour of Russia or the Soviet Union in 1979, and I think it was a sensation over there. And it's just very funny to picture Elton John, performing
in his Donald Duck spangled
exactly
costume.
In this sort of in like imagine like the sort of Bolshoi ballet or Leningrad concert hall or something like that, and as I understand it, like the front 4 rows would all be like Soviet apparatchiks, and because they get the good tickets, and they're all sort of sitting there stone faced because like they're obliged not to enjoy it, right? And actual fans are all kind of in the back, and going nuts for it apparently.
Well, okay, so this gives me two things to talk about. First, I think this is one of those U.S.-centric things that growing up in the States and having, again, in the 80s, that sort of patriotism shoved down your throats. I always thought Billy Joel was the first Western rock star to play.
Oh, you and Billy Joel.
I know, right? but I didn't know about this tour. When I heard about it when we were preparing for the podcast, I'm like, I can't believe that I never had heard of it. So that was one thing, and Elton John should get full credit for ending the Cold War, obviously.
Yeah.
The second thing is this idea of people being rock fans. I mean, behind the Iron Curtain, another huge part of like the cultural movement of Russia and the East and Eastern Europe's own baby boomers getting into Western rock, right? So
yes.
You've got Václav Havel with the Velvet Underground. You've got Atlas Obscura had a great story this week on, the Bone LPs they were LPs that were stitched, or not stitched, but like grooved into X-rays.
Ooh.
And that's the way they would smuggle them into Soviet Union to listen to. The youth of the Soviet Union, they were all these like rock and roll like subcultures and stuff like that, where they'd cargo cult their own sort of like rock and roll following in Russia and again in the other countries of the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah. That's a story that I wanted to tell was what's his name? David Thomas. He's a sort of avant-garde rocker, Per Ubu, I think.
Yeah.
So I read this. He tells a story of, I guess, right in the early '90s when after the wall fell and the opening of the Soviet Union or the collapse of the Soviet Union. I don't know what he was doing there, but basically he was amazed when he went to the Arctic region of Siberia, to Yakutsk, and saw a band there. And these are like ethnically, basically Inuit people, and they get up on stage and they start singing this music playing this music that he said sounded just like Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, except like Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, except like super intense and meaningful and powerful. And basically all the groups in Yakutsk sounded like Dark Side of the Moon because of one copy of Dark Side of the Moon had somehow made it there in the 80s and had just kind of galvanized this whole musical subculture of Inuit or whatever the Siberian equivalent of Inuit is. And they all loved this album and they all played to sound like this album. And, he asked them like, well, why, what's special about this album? And they said, it sounded like snow.
Wow. Oh my God.
I just love this image.
Combine that with the cover art too, right? Like sort of like the pure white light going in and being split by the prism. That's fantastic. That's really cool.
Yeah.
And all that is now, and all that is gone, and all that's to come, and everything under the sun is in view, and the sun is eclipsed by the moon.
So there was this period of opportunity and openness, but then by the time, Ronald Reagan comes in, pop culture reflects the paranoia and the stuff I was talking about, the sort of hyper-patriotism of the U.S. and the fear that there was going to be a nuclear exchange. Think about the Gen Xers kind of at the tail end of Gen X like me and you, Rob, and kind of how we grew up in a time that was almost equivalent to the duck and cover early 50s of the late silent generation people. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Nuclear war people started to really think of that as a reality, as a real fear again. The main difference from the 50s was that given the power of the MIRVs, ducking under your desk wasn't going to save your ass in 1983.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, and that's reflected in the sort of grim series of TV movies that came out during Reagan's first term. On both sides of the Atlantic, actually. I mean, the ones that I remember, I think most people know The Day After. That was an ABC TV movie.
Yes.
Pretty good. A lot of good actors in it.
Yeah, I remember we watched that in school, but we had to sign a permission form first. They sent a permission form home to see if we wanted to see it.
Okay, now that's good. I'm glad you mentioned that because to me, I don't remember that one very well. Maybe I'm a nuclear paranoia hipster here, but the one I remember was Testament on PBS.
Yeah.
Done, I think, a little earlier. It was like you know how there's always two movies that come out at the same time about the same thing?
Right. You got your
you know, two, Prefontaine
two
movies.
volcano movies,
Yeah,
two
exactly.
meteor movies, two nuclear war movies.
I think PBS could get away with being a little bit edgier. I mean, I know The Day After was very bleak and obviously had a lot of the stuff about, the slow dying that would happen. Testament, I remember one scene really, really well. So the mother, I think, was widowed because of the war, and she's got two kids, and they finally find like a battery, like months and months afterwards, and they put it into their little tape player, and they play the Beatles, All My Loving.
Oh.
And they're sort of like trying to pretend that everything is normal. And maybe I'm wrong about this memory, but the very next scene is the scene of the mother taping up her daughter in a body bag to be left out in front of the house. I mean, that kind of stuff just...
Yeah.
You connect it up with the sort of like the way music is a hotline to nostalgia, and like that scene, it still chills me to this very day.
Yeah.
On the other side of the Atlantic, they had Threads, which a lot of British people I've talked with of that age
I never
group.
saw Testament, but I did see Threads at one point, and that was that was dark.
Horrifying. I mean, again, in that sort of hauntological late 70s, early 80s BBC produced kind of thing. We grew up with nuclear fear. I mean, I was 8 years old in 1983 when all this stuff was going on. One of the people I remember very vividly from this period was Samantha Smith, a Maine schoolgirl who wrote to Yuri Andropov, saying, why do you want to have a war with us? Sort of.
Yeah.
And, the Soviets used it as kind of a sort of a PR thing, but in the process, Samantha Smith became kind of like a goodwill ambassador between the two countries. She died in a plane crash a couple of years after all this happened.
Yeah.
I'll keep silent about my suspicions that the CIA had a hand in it, but, she was close to my age. I think she was probably more your age, but she was 10, 11 years old when all this stuff happened, and, kids worried about nuclear war. I mean, it was the media had sort of bombarded us with this message of...
Well, how could you not worry about it?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, them sending us home with this permission slip saying, we're going to show The Day After in class because we think it's important for kids to watch this. And I see it is important, but what do you do with that knowledge? That's sort of like when the adults in the world are saying, yeah, this could happen.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll destroy the planet. We hope we won't, but maybe we will. I mean, what do you do with that knowledge as a kid? And it's not like you live with it ever present, thinking about it every moment of the day, but it was there, and it was...
If you're 8 years old and neurotic like I was, you think about it every night.
Yeah.
Though. I mean, there was a period where, again, I was a worried, anxious little kid, I mean, and to think about things on this scale, I mean, again, I had watched Cosmos by Carl Sagan. The last episode of that is about nuclear war and, to a lesser extent, environmental disaster, but again, in 1980... scientists, on both sides of the Iron Curtain were, working on disarmament. They wanted to, they didn't want the world to even experience the catastrophe of a limited global nuclear exchange,
Right.
That gets me thinking about war games.
Sure, war games, yeah. Oh,
I mean, my God.
Yeah. The, again, more great 80s Cold War, nuclear war pop culture.
That one has an interesting message, though. The whole movie is suffused in the military-industrial complex, including early computers, right?
It's the first time anyone saw a modem.
But it ends with a relatively hopeful message. If even the dumb AI can see that nuclear war is a completely hopeless endeavor, maybe the human beings can learn that exact same lesson. So it's a little bit more of a hopeful message than, Threads or The Day After, but it's,
But I suppose, the point is that, that by the time we got to the mid to late 80s, kind of the Baroque insanity of the whole structure was just really obvious in a kind of Emperor's New Clothes way. And yet, knowing that it was insane did not give anyone a magic key to to unlock or to... Knowing that it was insane didn't make it possible to walk away from the structure, at least not right away.
If only we had an Ozymandias to teleport a squid into New York City.
That's what we needed. Well, so I don't know how far off we want to go with this, but to some extent, Reagan and Gorbachev were our Ozymandiases, or maybe Gorbachev was our Ozymandias and Reagan was our giant squid. And I think the lion's share of credit for ending the Cold War has to go to the Russian people and the people of Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, Yugoslavia. So amazing movement of nonviolent political resistance against the harshest odds.
Yeah.
But if you give them the number 1 spot, then the number 2 spot has to go to Gorbachev for, his creativity and courage in trying to remake this system. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say it, for me, the number 3 spot goes to Reagan. Not for being tough on the Soviets, not for wanting to outspend them, not for being an old Cold War cowboy, but for his kind of like matter of fact, or not matter of fact, but, his kind of magical thinking, wishful thinking, ability to believe that, well, why don't we just get rid of all the nuclear weapons? Like the same impulse that led him to support Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, also led him, like Reykjavik in 1986, Gorbachev and Reagan are there and they're kind of making offers and feeling one each other out. And, Gorbachev says, well, why don't we just get rid of all the, strategic weapons in Europe? And Reagan says, well, why don't we get rid of all the strategic weapons? And Gorbachev says, well, why don't we get rid of all the nuclear weapons? And all of a sudden they're on the verge of abolishing nuclear weapons. And like, George Shultz and Edward Shevardnadze are like sitting next to them going, no, like, like doing the like, cut sign under their necks and what are you doing? But the two guys, like there's this moment in 1986.
If only Superman had swooped down with a giant net to collect all of the nuclear weapons and drag them into the sun at that moment.
Yes.
The whole of history would have been different.
Yes, that's what we needed.
But also, again, with Reagan and Gorbachev, it is a Nixon in China kind of moment, isn't it? It's the person you least expect to kind of want to de-escalate things. He ended up being the sort of wrong guy in the right place, I guess, at the right time. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, in a way, it was in part his cluelessness that allowed him to do this. They tell the story of like Reagan's first tour of, the NORAD headquarters underneath the mountain in North Dakota or wherever it is. And, they're showing him this and the big war, the kind of like, Dr. Strangelove war room. And, he says, so if the Soviets launched like nuclear missiles, what would we do? And they're like, what do you mean? And he said, well, how would we stop the missiles? And they're like, well, what do you mean, Mr. President? He's like, well, how would we shoot down the missiles? And they're like, we can't shoot down the missiles. If the Soviets launch the missiles, they're going to hit us. And he was like, what? And this is like 1980. Yeah. He didn't know that. And so then he's like, well, we got to do something about that.
Oh, yeah.
Let me just say, our technical people said what you sent us was incredible.
It is incredible. From the Latin, incredibilis. In meaning not, credibile meaning, well.
Your message said you had something vital for us? Something from the president's anti-ballistic missile program?
I'm giving it to you now, but you're not hearing me. The technology, it's incredibilis. At best, it's 50 years from being remotely operational. Damn thing's a fantasy.
Well, if that's true, why the commitment from the Reagan administration?
The hell if I'm supposed to know that. Some people say the president only hears what he wants to hear. Some say it's all one big psyop, a way of getting the Soviets to spend themselves into oblivion trying to keep up with a technology that'll never pan out. And really, it's just what the world needs, isn't it? Another crazy arms race, but this time in space.
So you grew up in Canada. Mm-hmm. So, did your Cold War experience differ from ours? Was it basically the same? What kind of memories do you have of, awaiting nuclear annihilation?
I don't think it differed that much. I mean, I remember, you must have done this too as a kid. People would breathlessly tell you that the city you lived near was like number 3 on the list of targets and number 8 on the list of targets. Yeah. And of course, living in Canada, this fed into a sort of, Canadian inferiority complex that we felt good that we were important enough to be on the list of targets.
Oh my
so
God.
I'm quite skeptical that Hamilton, Ontario, despite its important steel industry already crumbling by the 1980s, I'm quite skeptical that it was in fact, number 8 on the Soviet list of targets. But I remember being told that.
It's hardly hog disassembly. I mean, that's not a very important industry. Right.
Yeah, it's got to be lower down in Cincinnati. Nevertheless, yeah, I think we did have the same sort of stories and the same kind of fears. And I think that, most of the time as a kid, as a teenager, I probably thought about nuclear war more than I feared it. In other words, I thought about it in a kind of abstract way, like in a way, it was like Gamma World. It was like along with, it was just one of the imaginative playgrounds that I would picture along with Kryn and Middle Earth and Greyhawk and Vietnam. That those are sort of like the sort of the fantasy worlds that one might imagine, and like the post-apocalypse,
or indeed paranoia, right? Going underground,
or exactly Alpha Complex paranoia. That's right, another version of the same thing. But I will say that, did you ever do debating in high school?
I did Model UN. I did not do debating.
Close enough.
Well,
Model UN, you probably talked about the Cold War too. But so I was on the debate team in high school. So if I was in high school, that means that this is the late 80s.
Yeah.
So the Cold War must have been thawing, cooling off. Now, in this time, I mean, it wasn't as bad.
It was lukewarm. It was like lukewarm water. It was
lukewarm,
like
right? We're probably post-Reykjavik. Nevertheless, so how debate worked was you're on teams of 3, and you get the topic ahead of time, but you don't know what side you're going to argue until immediately before the debate. So you have to prepare both sides of the debate. It's the goal, the ethos of debate team is that you should be able to argue any position and not have any convictions.
Yeah.
So I was on the debate team, and we always did pretty well. But the time that we did the best, the topic was, I won't remember exactly, but it was something like, be it resolved, in the case of a Soviet attack, the West should massively retaliate with all nuclear weapons. And so you had to argue the pro or the con of that.
Pretty heady moral stuff for 16-year-olds, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, because, sometimes the other debates I remember were like, be it resolved, Tarzan was better off without Jane, or something like that, So we got the side that, yes, the U.S. or the West should massively retaliate. So we were arguing for massive retaliation. And, we divvied up the arguments, and I think that probably one person took the kind of better dead than red line of argument.
Sure.
One
simplistic
person,
but tried and true.
Yep. One person took the sort of Herman Kahn, Dr. Strangelove, deterrence argument that only by absolutely committing to destroying the planet can we save the planet. That kind of crazy, insane logic. And in a way, I don't know, adolescent boys are like sort of the perfect people to make that kind of argument. Like,
the Alex P. Keaton types, right? Like,
yes. Well, have I said that already? That I really was an Alex P. Keaton conservative in high school. Am I outing myself as that?
You are. Between this and the country music, I may need to find a new partner at this point. I don't know.
Yep. And I know how they sell worms. Okay. It's true. I was an Alex P. Keaton conservative, and I think that this goes to why I was well equipped to argue this. It's sort of a combination of a certain level of cleverness and verbal dexterity combined with utter callowness and lack of wisdom or, any kind of, human empathy or, and that combination of...
That's the definition of realpolitik, isn't it? It's sort of...
Exactly. And so that combination of things made the three of us indestructible in this debate. And, we did it. We made the case for total nuclear annihilation, and we got a perfect score. They scored you out of 30, and 3 judges, they scored you out of 30, and I'd never got that before, and I'd never heard of anyone getting that. And we got a perfect score, and we just absolutely mowed over the people who were, arguing the actual sane, moral position. And I kind of remember in my mind's eye, I can see them, their mouths hanging agape as we destroyed them, even as we, didn't have a shred of humanity or anything like that in our arguments. And we all like high-fived and felt awesome and that kind of thing. But here's the thing. I went home afterwards and I really kind of felt sick. Like I just, I hadn't really thought about any of the stuff I was saying. And I feel like, the story would be better if I like threw up or something. And I didn't, but I did all that night just felt completely shaky and shitty and just, kind of inhabiting that insanity. And parroting it and getting patted on the head for it and winning the little prize, did not make me feel good in the long run. And, now I think, we have to do everything we can to kind of save the world from adolescent boys or adolescent men with a certain amount of verbal dexterity and no humanity because, they are a problem.
It's funny. You were talking about like what kind of people does a existential threat like total global nuclear annihilation produce, And you're right. If you're 15, 16 years old, you're going to look at things in, like you said, Manichaean terms, right? It's going to be that sort of good versus evil thing.
Yep.
But I think in the end, I think what that period of the 80s produced in our generation was that sort of, again, 90s slacker distrust of authority kind of thing. I mean, the baby boomers came by their distrust of authority because they grew up in the 50s where it was so easily mockable. Growing up in the 80s, it wasn't mockable because, as you say, it made some kind of twisted, weird, logical sense that this is the kind of war we would have to fight, you know what I mean? And it's like, and I think that it made us more critical in our sort of skepticism about power structures and such. Yeah,
to vastly oversimplify, I think that the youth movements of the 60s came out of the anger, the betrayal that generation felt when they realized that all the things they had been told in the 1950s, that their nation wasn't living up to it. And they were kind of like, they believed it so much, they believed all the good things about America so much that they kind of demanded that the nation live up to its highest ideals. Yeah. But for us, it's much more likely to, you grow up already jaded and you live in a world where, everything is permitted and nothing is valued.
All right, that's Jesus. We gotta go back and talk about Michael Pataki and Sam Anderson now. I mean,
laddie, don't you think you should rephrase that?
You're right. I should. I didn't mean to say that the Enterprise should be hauling garbage. I meant to say that it should be hauled away as garbage.
So Ivan, Michael Pataki, a classic, that guy, right? I mean, I recognized him in the episode because I had just watched Rocky IV. Anytime Rocky 3 or 4 is on TV, Rob, I'm going to watch it. Yeah,
but so, we like to check out our guest stars, and Michael Pataki, total that guy. So he was one of the Russian functionaries in the background of Rocky IV. He was on the old Batman show I think he was like one of King Tut's henchmen.
Oh,
he was
he hench or man?
Well, whatever that. What's Egyptian for henchman? But
they had hieroglyphics instead of big letters on them.
Exactly. One of Pataki's claims to fame is that he was the first actor to speak the Klingon language on screen.
Yep.
As the loudmouth Klingon in the famous Trouble with Tribbles episode.
I think the line is, he says something like, in 20 years, you'll all be speaking Klingonese, which is what they called it back in that episode. And
which, of course, Trouble with Tribbles and the Klingons, that's Cold War culture too, right? I mean,
it totally is. There's spies, there's grain, like it's, it's like a perfect Cold War allegory. Absolutely.
Even right down to the Klingons are stand-ins for the Soviets, even in the, what was the movie where they had the
Star Trek 6 where the moon blows up?
Space Chernobyl. And,
Space Chernobyl! Oh my god, that's awesome! I thought it was the Space Berlin Wall falling, but you're right, it is. Yeah. No, it is Space Chernobyl. You're absolutely right. Oh my god.
And then, our friend Jamie Weinman wrote a obituary for Michael Pataki when he died in 2010, which we can link to in the show notes. Nice little discussion of all the things he had done. He was the voice of George Licker on Ren and Stimpy.
Yeah, I know. God, I never would have picked him out there.
Yep.
Yeah.
He was the evil drag racer who competed against the Fonz and Pinky Tuscadero. And Weinman uses him to talk about sort of the disappearance of the TV character actor, sort of that nowadays that part quite possibly be sort of stunt cast by some celebrity or some sort of bigger name. But the guy that just sort of comes in and fills in the way that Pataki does or Sam Anderson does, that's what Pataki was. And then obviously Pataki had a bit of a corner on playing Russians.
Yep.
So he played Ivan in this. He played the Russian in Rocky IV. And he essentially played the same part in this sitcom I had no memory of, but this short-lived CBS sitcom called Phil and Mickey. That's Phil spelt with a Y and Mickey spelled M-I-K-H-Y. That ran for 6 episodes on CBS in 1980, right in this time period. And
he auditioned for it basically with the Ivan role, I guess.
I guess he did. So let me see. Where's the little description of it? So this was a 6-episode sitcom. It starred Rick Loman, Murphy Cross, and Larry Haynes. None of those names mean anything to me.
Immortals all, yeah.
Yes, exactly. It was about a couple who...
So they were both for like the track team or something like that for the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and Mickey defects. It's a literal sort of defection plot line, and it's like Moscow on the Hudson. He has to like get used to like living in the land of plenty, and obviously, because you've got to have an antagonist for any goofy sitcom, he's trailed by Russian agent Gamenko, who tries to convince him to return to Russia. Because on a sitcom, they're not going to use the ice pick. They're going to use goofy comedy sitcom chatter to try and get you to go back to Russia.
That's right. And so that Russian agent, Gamenko, is, I think, Michael Pataki is the agent. And you can see him, if you look on YouTube, we can link to this in the show notes too. The opening credits of the episode of the sitcom are in YouTube, and they are delightful. They are kind of like the Too Many Cooks version of that great training montage, because you see Phil running and you see Mickey running in Russia, and they come together, and it's a beautiful thing.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, the defection narrative, of course, is so great for star-crossed romance, right?
Yes,
that
exactly.
It's the perfect.
We wouldn't know anything about marrying somebody from a different country, would we?
Yeah, exactly. The challenge in romantic comedy is always to find serious enough obstacles. Like, why can't they be together?
Yes.
But this is a perfect one. But it's better than Romeo and Juliet. So I also think about going back to Elton John. Do you remember his song and the video, Nikita?
Oh, yeah. I was just thinking about that.
Who played the woman in that? I have to confess to digging that song and being in love with that beautiful East German border guard that he did. You know that there's a website, The Girl in the Video, where a guy tracks down and does interviews with all of the models and actresses who were in 1980s videos.
Yeah.
Hold on, I'm going to Google that.
Sure.
Anya Major,
yeah.
Oh, that's cool. She's also the woman in the famous Apple Computer 1984 commercial.
Oh my God!
Smashing.
So awesome.
She's fighting totalitarianism everywhere you look.
That's amazing.
Or she's part of totalitarianism and then she's fighting it.
There was a big bumper crop in 80s pop songs about how awful and wrong the Cold War was. So you got Sting.
Yep.
And then you remember Frankie Goes to Hollywood had two tribes?
Yes.
There was the video where it was the metaphor was Chernyenko and Reagan wrestling in a ring and like throwing dirt in each other's eyes and stuff. And it was like, and then the whole world blows up at the end.
That's right. The convenient thing about him falling in love with Nikita was that she was stationed right at the wall, right next to a parking lot in the West.
Oh.
So he could just drive up and see her marching around. Even though they couldn't be together, it was really not that hard for him to sort of like just cruise by and see her.
It must be the most popular spot for scaling the wall. Well, that makes me think of Hedwig and the Angry Inch, actually. That's another Cold War,
another great Cold War culture thing.
I always wondered how, I mean, there's that scene in the movie where Luther's kind of looking down on Hedwig, and I'm like, was this possible? Am I crazy? Or is this some kind of weird, like, just musical metaphor for them meeting? And how did they meet? And that seems like a big gap to me in the narrative Hedwig and the Angry Inch.
On August 13, 1961, a wall was erected down the middle of the city of Berlin. The world was divided by a Cold War, and the Berlin Wall was the most hated symbol of that divide. Reviled, graffitied, spit upon, we thought the wall would stand forever. And now that it's gone, we don't know who we are anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, Hedwig is like that wall, standing before you in a divide between East and West, slavery and freedom, man and woman, top and bottom, and you can try and tear her down. But before you do, you must remember one thing.
Ain't much of a difference between a bridge and a wall. Without me right in the middle there, wow, you've been roughing it off. An amazing adversary, they try and tear me down. You want me, baby, I tell you. Wow, try and tear me down. Yeah.
All right, we should probably get on to Les's groupie at this point because.
But we never talked about the Americans.
Oh no! Yeah, we should. I guess we should.
We can't have this long conversation about great Cold War culture without mentioning what I know is one of your favorite shows and is definitely one of mine, The Americans.
Yeah, I mean, talk about the perfect confluence of everything we've talked about so far. 80s nostalgia, which just comes up again and again. They get it so right. I mentioned in the show notes how. Their set designers and prop designers they'll just plaster the walls with like Sears catalogs from that period to get the clothing right and everything else. So they get so much of that right.
Yeah, maybe there's not that much to say other than we dig The Americans. It's a terrific show, and it is, right set in our magic moment of late 1970s, early 1980s.
Yeah.
So there's also often nice pop culture stuff, including in one episode, young Henry is watching WKRP in Cincinnati.
Hi.
Are you there?
Yes, I am, and I can hear you much better now. What's your name,
My
sugar?
name's Darlene.
Hi.
And I just wanted to call and tell you that I think you're the sexiest man in Cincinnati radio.
Well, thank you very much, Darlene, and allow me to compliment you on your obvious sense of taste and style.
You know, I've often had fantasies about you.
Is that so? Tell you what, Darlene, I got a couple of minutes here. Why don't you just run down a few of those fantasies for me?
I think that's disgusting.
Who's that?
Oh, don't be upset, sweetheart. It's just Les Nessman, the newsman.
Wait a minute. You mean this isn't Les Nessman I'm talking to?
So our next episode is Les's Groupie. Probably, I have to say, this has got to be the only sitcom episode I can remember from my childhood that starts with a possible obscene phone call. But yeah, Johnny gets a call in the booth. He starts talking to the lady on the phone, thinking that Johnny thinks that she really digs his voice, but she's actually talking about Les.
Yes.
And so Les meets Darlene, his number one fan, who within a week has moved in and basically proceeds to make Les's life extremely difficult. Les at first welcomes the attention, but eventually gets hip to the fact that Darlene, and we'll talk about this a little later, Darlene may be a little bit crazy. The final straw being the famous scene, which is the only scene I remember from childhood, again, seeing Les's walls get ripped up, his tape walls on the floor.
Right.
Everybody in the station knows what those mean to him. Even Herb, it's like, oh boy, you better not do that. And then she...
That's the Rubicon. That's
exactly.
the line that she crosses, quite literally, or the line that she erases.
So it's a, again, pretty simple plot, but it reveals a lot about Les, a lot about the people at the station and how they feel about Les. They're very protective of him. They want to make sure this woman isn't trying to take advantage of him. From the very start, actually, I think, is it Johnny or Andy that says you got to watch out for these phone groupies, these radio groupies? They'll ruin your life. I think it's Andy, actually.
That's right. There's a fair bit of everybody has to congratulate him on having a groupie, but then
very similar to a date with Jennifer. The whole hey Les, haha.
Yeah, but Johnny, Venus, and Andy all have a thing or two to say about radio groupies.
Hey, Les Nessman, you devil, you. I understand you've been burning up the airwaves for the ladies, huh?
Well, Travis, if you've got it, you've got it.
Some of these girls got a screw loose. Back when I was on the air in Amarillo, I got hooked up with a lady that wanted to wear my clothes.
A funny thing happened to me once.
Just be careful, Les, all right?
Look, this isn't something seedy and disgusting like Andy's girlfriends. And this lady...
Les, just be careful about getting mixed up with phone groupies.
Well, maybe she's not a groupie, Andy. Maybe she's a fine, intelligent, sensitive woman.
Yeah, well, just watch it. People on the air make convenient targets.
Targets for what?
For all kinds of things. Like a fraternity suit.
Fraternity suit?
Yeah, I didn't love this episode, but it parts the curtain a fair bit on Les. Yeah. We get to see much more of Les's life. We get to see his apartment. Big deal there. Anytime we get to see the home set of somebody, that's always a good reveal.
Yes, we've done this detailed analysis on Andy's and Johnny's and Jennifer's apartments. So let's do the breakdown of Les.
Yeah.
What's the first thing you see right to the right of the door? It's an old steel filing cabinet. So perfect. He's got 5 awards on the wall. I have to imagine those are the paper versions of the Buckeye Newshawk Awards. When you get an award, you get the trophy, and then you get a little piece of paper, right? So He's got those hanging prominently on the wall. And then behind like what looks like an extra reinforced door at the back of the main room of the apartment is Phil's room.
Yes, we hear the barking, and in order to feed Phil, Les puts on a huge padded glove and picks up a giant dog bowl. So we get we've never met Phil, Les's presumably huge and ferocious dog.
Well, the first thing I was going to say, wouldn't it be hilarious if later in the series we saw Phil, he was like a chihuahua or something like that.
Could be.
Just incredibly vicious. But yeah, the story of the creation of Phil actually dates all the way back to the pilot, when Richard Sanders had an accident on set, banged his head, I think he said, on one of the, studio lights, and had to wear a Band-Aid or bandage on his head. And, after the first few episodes, that wound started healing up, so the bandage slowly got, smaller and smaller. But then Richard Sanders started just putting Band-Aids on random parts of his visible body during the series.
Yes.
Initially the idea was that, Les is probably one of these people who can't do anything right at home. He's a klutz, but they tied in the idea of him having a vicious dog that, weak, pusillanimous Les cannot take care of, to reflect why he would always have a Band-Aid on a random part of his body.
So the dog is always biting and attacking Les. Exactly. That's very nice.
Phil? Darlene?
Starlight, star bright, first star I've seen tonight.
Hi, Darlene. I see you've been rearranging the furniture again.
Oh, I did? How do you like it?
Wonderful. Looks like Star Trek.
Other things about Les's apartment. I didn't think the decor screamed Les in any particular way. Not that I know what Les decor would be like, but a few things I did like. One was the lone record on his record track. He asks Darlene if she wants to listen to some music and is pleased when she says whatever you like, because he only has one record. It's Chances Are by Johnny Mathis, which is a lovely kind of, 50s throwback.
Yeah.
Speaking of 50s throwback, another thing that Richard Sanders did, Les's glasses are Richard Sanders' own high school glasses.
Oh my God.
At least that's how they started, was when he either when he was auditioning or else for the pilot, he still had his old glasses from like being a teenager in the 1950s. And so he has these old fashioned, slightly too small glasses.
It's perfect. Doesn't he sing Elvis during the episode, Never Leaving Lucille, where Herb is in the office early and Les is doing his calisthenics?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
He likes the classics, because there's also, I believe he sings The Great Pretender later on in the season. And then when he offers Darlene a drink, he can only offer her soft drinks or whiskey, which is great. So that's what Les has on hand, because he's a newsman,
Exactly. All newsmen drink. It's just part of the rough and tumble type of guys they are, right?
Play Misty for me.
For Clint Eastwood, an invitation to terror.
You ever find yourself being completely smothered by somebody?
There's no escape in passion. There's no escape in speed. There's no escape from terror.
You will change the locks, huh?
Nobody asked you to wait for it.
You're not dumping me, Buster Blue-Eye.
Get off my back, Evelyn.
Yeah, I mean, what do we make of Darlene as an actress? The guest star whose name I'm blanking on is she's just another one of those ones who's fine.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah,
but then I'm actually less interested in the performance and more interested in the character. How do we read her?
Sure.
By doing this show, we sort of have become, or at least we are posing as, early 80s pop culture experts. Yeah. But I wasn't totally sure how to read Darlene, like whether she is crazy or what her deal is. And there were times in this episode when I was like, there are cultural reference that I'm not getting. So when he comes home the second time, or when he comes home and she's like wearing a leotard and she has this big plate of hors d'oeuvres, like what type of lady is this? What exactly is the vibe here?
Well, again, it's WKRP very rarely goes full hog with sort of their, again, no pun intended, with their implications about people being like like, everybody's always a little quirky, but nobody's ever, like, full-on insane. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
Like, this is not a play Misty for me sort of stalker situation. And yet, that's what I think we're kind of meant to think as time goes on.
Right.
Again, from the very beginning, Johnny's oracular warnings about, and Andy's sort of warnings about, don't get involved. I don't think she's crazy. I think that she's also probably lonely. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, in a world, in Les's world, in the world of Les and Herb and Mr. Carlson, like, what is crazy? You could be very eccentric. And so it seems harsh to, like, that Darlene is untouchable because she's crazy. And I think it's significant that her ultimate crime is not craziness, but rather it's not respecting Les's idiosyncrasies, right? That's when she goes too far.
I think that's a great point. I think one of the things that we see that Darlene makes changes to in his apartment is she puts up, they seem to me to be kind of like late 70s kind of new age poster type things. They add a splash of color to Les's apartment that in its beige and brown sort of like, and again, steel filing cabinet decor was sorely needed, but it's so obvious that it's not Les. It's completely her.
Right. And then she wants to put the ridiculous yellow floral wallpaper up in the bullpen, which makes no sense at all.
Exactly. If redecoration is the great, that's what it is basically. She's moving in and kind of, and taking over Les's life and the things that
she rearranges the furniture so it looks like Star Trek.
That was what made me think that these were like, new age sci-fi posters.
I suppose that this is somebody's idea of a joke. Putting tape all around Les's desk.
Actually, that's Les's idea.
He put that tape there to show where walls would be if he had an office.
It's something we all respect.
Oh, yeah.
I think it looks silly.
I wouldn't,
What? Oh, hi, dear.
What are you doing to my office walls?
Oh, never mind, my little Lester Wester.
You can't come in here and do that.
What did I tell you? Gruff and grumbly.
Darlene?
Yeah, she's lonely, right? She's lonely, nerdy, and a little controlling. And I think that's as far as we can go with it. Again, we're not talking about somebody who's going to, boil Phil alive or something like that in the manner of a Fatal Attraction.
I did have that. There are echoes of that, but no, it doesn't go there. But if she is a Les Nessman super fan, then she's going to be a little bit odd. But it's strange that as a Les Nessman super fan, she then wants to change Les.
Yeah, you're right. That doesn't really hold up under scrutiny, does it? Because she would have to understand after having the discussion about his awards and how he does his news and how particular he is. Maybe she sees him and meets him for the first time and thinks, here's somebody I can mold. You know what I mean? Here's somebody I can change into something perfect for me.
That might have been a different way to take the episode is what if, when he comes back after the date and he's singing Chances Are and all sort of full of brio from his successful date. What if she was remaking him literally? So he comes in and he, instead of wearing the bow tie, he's wearing like a sharp suit.
Yeah. Or a leotard, like a new age, sort of like, he's all of a sudden looking like a yoga trainer or something like that,
That would have taken it in a whole other direction. Not bad. You mentioned in the notes Les's idea for a hot date.
Yeah.
He doesn't take her to body painting at the university. He takes her to the planetarium.
I actually have a little story on this because I have taken a second date to the planetarium.
Yeah.
But in my defense, I was in college. And B, it was Laser Zeppelin. So, you know, I mean, that adds a little cachet.
Were you in college in 1977?
No, man. We still had it at the Museum of Science, man.
No, I know. It kept going. I totally get it. I know the laser, the
sad
laser
story of that day
planetarium
was
thing.
we were in such a hurry to get to the, you know, the exciting laser, you know, it's only done like, you know, 4 times a day, right?
Yeah.
We were in such a hurry to get there. I parked in an illegal zone at the Museum of Science. Midway through the laser show, I'm like, I left my car in a tow zone. We have to go now. So as far as disastrous dates go, that one is high on a fairly long list of disastrous dates I've had.
Ooh, that's good.
So Nicole, if you're listening, I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you sometime. You know, maybe in a few years we can go catch Floyd, Laser Floyd at the planetarium.
Sorry, Nicole.
I am the Wolf Man. Yes, sir. How do you do and how are you? Hey, yeah, I'm coming to you and I am the Wolf Man. What we say around here is, we believe in the wolf. Fantastic. All right, let's find out what's happening. Hello, I am the Wolf Man. What's that you want to hear? Jumpin' Jack Flash? Well, that's a real oldie goldie. Okay, babe, you got it. Right, all right, bye-bye.
Johnny very, like, openly and freely just decides to just go in and start listening to this woman, like, talking in a breathy voice to him on the phone in the booth with Les there. So I'm thinking, again, it's from what Johnny, Venus, and Andy have said, there's always these people who they find DJ sexy, right? They find them like they only hear the voice.
Yeah. And that you would even sort of go in that direction. Like, in other words, they do warn Les off it.
Yeah.
But I have to think that today, a disc jockey today would be much more wary of just, let's see where this goes with any random voice on the phone. There's definitely, but Johnny, sure, Johnny's gonna go for it. It's one of, I think,
Johnny's all about cheap thrills and like lazy, like dates, basically, you know, it's like,
yeah, for those FM, freeform 70s FM DJs, I'm sure that the groupies were just one of the perks of the job.
Exactly.
Now, I don't know, I don't want to be too crude, but it might be difficult. The problem with being a voice on the radio is if you don't look like what people picture the voice, it might be hard to convert as it is.
Isn't that the story of like when Wolfman Jack was broadcasting from Mexico, everybody thought that he was like their race. So like Latino listeners thought, oh man, this guy's like from Southern California or Mexico. He's Latino. Black listeners thought he was black, and white listeners, I think a lot of white listeners wanted to be black for that sort of like, cachet of the sort of white hipster whole thing.
Yep.
Yeah, like, and then, Wolfman Jack took very, detailed, precautions to make sure he was never photographed, but eventually he was, and his real face got out, and literally everybody was disappointed. He didn't, even though, you look back at Wolfman Jack, and he definitely looks cool in that late 60s kind of,
I guess I never didn't know what he looked like, so I wasn't disappointed.
We were too late for that, exactly.
Is he in American Graffiti? Is that a thing at the end?
Yeah,
yes.
he's
so
one.
I think that's probably where I saw him and knew what he looked like.
I saw him from his many guest appearances on late 70s and early 80s TV shows. Hollywood Square, he was everywhere.
But the problem is that as a kid, I always conflated him with the actual Wolfman who was a DJ on the hilarious House of Frightenstein.
Oh, right. That local horror show that you had that had Vincent Price on randomly enough.
Yeah, exactly. So they were halfway through each episode, the Wolfman DJ would come on, would put on some psychedelic music, and the whole screen would go into a sort of psychedelic thing. And for 5 minutes, the Wolfman and Igor would dance. And that was it was just this kind of head trip right in the middle. And then now back to Vincent Price and cartoons.
You sure this wasn't Candle Cove? Because this sounds like one of those memories. And then they would just scream silently for a whole half hour, and I'd have no idea why. Oh, God.
When am I gonna take control, get a hold of my emotions? Why does it only seem to hit me in the middle of the night? There's a number I can always dial for assistance. I don't want to deal with outside action. Only you can give me satisfaction. It's just a fantasy. It's not the real thing. It's just a fantasy. It's not the real thing. Sometimes a fantasy is all you need.
So to get back to the booth.
Yes.
I put in the notes I wanted to talk about 70s and 80s phone sex. And and the reason why is another Billy Joel related thing, because in 1980 he put out Glass Houses, it was his new wave inspired album. I know you almost spit out your coffee there when I said, Billy Joel's new wave inspired album. Is it the lead off track? No, its second track is Sometimes a Fantasy, which is an ode to phone sex. And it's sort of like, it's a history of technology question, Rob. It totally is.
Right. Yep.
It's not popular now, but there was a small period between the sexual revolution and the coming of the internet where it was a thing.
Absolutely, sure. Now, when you say it's an ode to phone sex, do you mean are we talking about a couple, an existing couple, sharing fantasies with each other over the line, or is this a commercial transaction?
Now, see, this is how deep Billy Joel lyrics go. This is what you need to know: is that no, there's a lot of it sounds in the song more like it's a long distance relationship, but he also talks about how desperate he is. So it might be somebody he's no longer with. So it's the depth and breadth of Billy Joel's lyrical prowess here, really, that keeps us guessing, even now, 35 years later.
Well, I think, that is the eros of the telephone.
Mm-hmm.
Putting on my telephone historian hat for a moment, the telephone
I don't know why this is the question I want to ask you about telephone history. It's a little weird, but I think again, it's so just obsolete now. You know what I mean? And it just seems like almost quaint at this point.
Yeah, I think that the telephone is kind of, you're a long way away, and yet it is intimate.
Yes.
Right?
It's a voice right in your ear, basically.
Maybe, to me, more intimate than like a face on a screen, even in a weird way. Just this sort of, maybe it's just growing up in that generation. But so when the telephone was brand new, it didn't take people long to think of the erotic possibilities of this. And there was definitely, when the telephone exploded into mass use in like the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, a couple of things happened. One is that men fell in love with operators, with telephone girls, and they would rhapsodize about the sweet dulcet tones of the hello girls, they called them, the operators, because you had an operator to connect every call. And the other thing is that there was much discussion of the proprieties of telephone behavior and whether it was appropriate, for instance, for a woman to speak to a man on the telephone when he wasn't dressed, or when she was in her bedroom, or when her auntie wasn't nearby. And a lot of, there's a kind of moral panic about our young girls by the 1920s, are speaking on the telephone in their nightgowns.
This reminds me of those old Hays Code things. If two people are on a bed in a movie, they have to have 3 feet on the floor at all times, these really kind of odd, random kind of requirements. So yes, like many things we've talked about, Rob, in the 1970s, phone sex was local. It was, person to person. And then in the 1980s, deregulation and all of these, it led to an explosion of, for-profit phone sex lines.
See, we can even turn a discussion of smut into our standard complaint about political economy and deregulation.
Never let it be said that we can make a sexy topic completely unsexy. That is what you tune in for every 2 weeks here at Hold My Order, Terrible Dresser.
Hey, thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back soon with more WKRP riffs and memories. If you like this well enough to listen to the whole thing, tell somebody about it.
We're online at holdmyorderterribledresser.com, which, believe it or not, wasn't taken. We're also available on iTunes, and we always appreciate your iTunes subscriptions, reviews, ratings, and downloads. So get on there and give us some stars.
Good day, and may the good news be yours.
If you've ever wondered whatever became of me, I'm living on the air in Cincinnati, WKRP. I'm at WKRP in Cincinnati.